So I'm going to start by giving you a quick overview of food waste. Why do we care about it as an issue of sustainability? What the project's about. And then I'm going to go through 4 different methods. We've got survey analysis, content analysis, interviews, and ethnographic work. Those are the 4 things that I'm going to look at. I'm going to talk about them to varying degrees, mainly because I'm only sort of directly involved in some of this stuff. And I've cheated a little bit because we haven't actually engaged in any ethnographic work as part of the current project. The project leader, David Evans, did ethnographic work as part of his previous project, but it's a really interesting methodology, so I thought I'd just stick it on the end because it was about food waste. So I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we've got maybe 20 minutes for questions and discussion. So, food waste. What's it all about? Why do we care from a sustainability perspective? Well, the statistics tell us that consumers in industrialized countries waste almost as much food as the entire net food production of sub-Saharan Africa. It's a massive amount of food that's being wasted. The Institute of Mechanical Engineers, which sounds a bit random for food waste, but they've done a lot of stuff on food waste, calculate that 30 to 50% of all food produced never reaches the human stomach. It's gone to landfill, it's gone back in the ground. And if we translate this into carbon emissions, RAP tells us that eliminating avoidable food waste in the UK, some 4.2 million tonnes a year, would be the equivalent reduction in greenhouse gas emissions of taking 1 in 4 cars off the road. So this is a huge issue in terms of environmental impact, not just in terms of the energy that goes into producing food, which is then wasted, but also the emissions that come off food that decomposes, that goes back in the ground. So this is why we care about it from the SEI point of view. And it's an issue that's risen hugely in profile over the last few years. In 2012, the European Parliament passed a resolution saying that they were going to do something about this. They were going to try and tackle the issue. And earlier this year, the House of Lords took evidence from a wide range of different stakeholders and wrote a lengthy report on food waste. That's where the first statistic comes from. We've seen retailers engaging with the issue and a huge push from NGOs, such as sort of Feeding the 5K, the Food Ethics Council, who all want something done about this. And what we've found is that current work in the social sciences on food waste is very theoretical or very qualitative, like David's ethnographic work. There wasn't sort of a mixed methods approach to looking at food waste, to finding out about things. So David put a bid into the ESRC, and he came out with some money. And we've got this project, which is households, retailers, and food waste transitions. Money came, like I say, from the ESRC and some from the Sustainable Consumption Institute. The project began January this year and runs until March next year. And that's what we're doing. And among other things, we have sort of these main objectives. So the first thing we wanted to do was to develop a social scientific account of household food waste using quantitative data sets to see where, how, and why food waste occurs. That's one thing we wanted to do. The second thing was to trace the discursive emergence of food waste as a critical sustainability challenge. How has this been talked about in the past? How is it changing over time? And the third thing was to understand the mechanics that are currently being used to tackle food waste, particularly at the intersection of households and retailers. So what are households doing? What are retailers doing? And what are retailers doing to help households reduce their food waste? So these were the things that we were interested in. And because it was such a wide range of objectives, we were keen to use a wide range of different methodologies. So that's the project. Are there any questions or anything I need to clarify in terms of what we did before I go on to methods? Nope? Great, okay. So the first thing we did was survey analysis. And this is the project team at the bottom. I don't know if you can see the photographs there. You will see that I'm not on there. So I have not been directly involved with the quantitative stuff. I'm going to tell you about it, and I can answer questions to an extent, but I'm not a quantitative expert. But this is David Evans, who's the project leader, Dale, Jen, and Luke, and they've all been involved with the survey analysis. So the good thing about the food waste project was that these members of the team already had access to 2 big data sets. They didn't have to go and collect the data themselves. We already had data to use. So the first data set was the Shopper Thoughts panel. And this was research that was designed and collected by Tesco and Dunnhumby, which is a research institute. And I should sort of caveat it by saying that the SCI got a big chunk of its original funding from Tesco. It was Tesco put a sort of call out for research institutions. It wanted to fund someone, and Manchester won the money, okay? So Tesco funded a lot of our research, and they give us access to research that they've already done. So the Shopper Thoughts panel is a data set of around about 27,000 respondents who were members of Tesco's Club Card loyalty scheme, okay? And in exchange for loyalty points, they agreed to fill in online surveys. And the survey was a huge thing. It had questions on transport, I guess different kinds of shopping, petrol, everything. But one module of it was about eating and food purchases, and food waste was part of that. So 60% of those 27,000 respondents filled in the eating and food purchasing module. And I've missed off the statistic that tells you what number we were left with, but a lot of people in that survey, so a big data set. The purpose of this was to look at the individual as the unit of analysis. So the survey was interested in individual characteristics that were leading to food waste, identifying socio-demographic factors that affected. So people were asked questions like, how old are you? What's your level of income? What level of education are you at? And then, do you waste food? How much food do you waste? And the point was to correlate these things, to see what factors are affecting food waste. So that was one survey. The second was a food diary survey. And this was actually designed and collected by the SCI. We didn't do it as part of the current project, but it was done by people who were already at the SCI. So it was something else that we had access to. And it was completed by 1,500 members of the original Shopper Thoughts panel. So the people who had signed up for the initial survey, everyone was contacted, and we said, would you mind filling in a food diary survey? And about 1,500 people went ahead and did that. And instead of looking at the individual as the unit of analysis, what this was interested in was the meal itself. So not how old are you, do you waste food, but rather what type of meal did you engage in? How long was it? How was it prepared, etc. And how much food was left over. And the idea was to report up to 7 eating events for 1 weekday and 1 weekend day. So if you had agreed to do the food diary, I would have given you a blank piece of paper, a template, and said to you, can you please think about the last weekday and 1 day of the previous weekend, and can you write down 7 meals that you engaged in? So breakfast, brunch, lunch, afternoon tea, whatever. And people were asked to write down, in their own words, the food that they ate, and then the length of the meal, who they ate it with, where they ate it, where the food came from, and then questions about what was left. So were there leftovers? Did you use them? How did you store them? How did you dispose of them? So this is all the information that we then had for sort of 1,500 people. Okay, so that was the two data sets. And then just to give you an idea of the kinds of things that came out of that, the 4 people there sort of broke into 2 teams, and they did a paper each. So Jen and David looked at the Shopper Thoughts panel and the food diary. They looked at both. In terms of the Shopper Thoughts panel, they found out that men are less likely to report food waste than women. Older people are more likely to waste food than younger people. And as the level of education increases, reported food waste decreases. So there was more than that, but that gives you a general idea of the socio-demographic factors that were leading to food waste, according to the data set. And then they looked at the food diary survey, and what they were interested in was what factors were leading to leftovers. So what is it about the meal that means there'll be leftovers at the end, and what happens to those? Do they go in the bin? Do we put them in the fridge? And the big thing that came out of this paper was that as the proportion of the meal that is left increases, the probability of it going to waste decreases. So if I cook a meal and it's, say, 100%, and I eat 50%, or my husband and I eat 50%, if there's 50% left over, it's likely to go into the fridge because it's a big proportion. If we eat the meal and there's 10% left over, it's more likely to go into the bin. That was the big finding. And it's a lot more complicated than that because they're better at the quantitative stuff. There's charts, but that was the main finding that came out. So that was Jen and David's paper. With Luke and Dale, they were looking at the preparation of the meal and the occasion, so who people were eating with, to see what sort of effect that had on leftovers. And they were solely looking at the food diary. So they found things like longer meals are more likely to produce leftovers than shorter meals. If your meal is over 40 minutes long, it's more likely to have leftovers than if it's under 20 minutes long, was one statistic. Meals eaten with others are 3 times more likely to have leftovers than those eaten alone. Meals eaten out are 3.6 times more likely to have leftovers than those eaten in the house. Meals prepared by others are 2 times more likely to have leftovers than those you prepare yourself. So again, just some idea of the kinds of things that were coming out. So issues to consider with the data sets. So in terms of survey data, it's a really good way to explain things, right? To find correlations in the data. So we're finding lots of things about socio-demographic factors, how the meal affects it, wide range of data, and lots of correlations, and a great breadth of data. With the 2 papers that I've told you about there, that's just 2 examples of the kinds of things that have come out. Since they've done those papers, they're not published yet, but since they've done those papers, they've presented at lots of different conferences using the same data sets and coming up with lots of different things. So there's a huge breadth of data, a lot of different things you can do with a big data set like that. But of course, one thing that you might then miss is the depth of the data. We know that longer meals are more likely to have leftovers, but we don't know why that might be the case, okay? The quantitative data, the survey doesn't tell you in-depth things. So that's one possible problem with it. In terms of representativeness, with the 2 data sets that we had, they weren't completely representative of the UK population, because we said to people, would you like some loyalty points? Will you fill in our survey? And the people that selected themselves to do that tended to be, generally older than the average, more affluent than the average, and better educated than the average. So we can say some interesting things about that group of people, but we can't apply the things that we found out to the entire population. If you're doing your research and you do your own data set, you do your own collection of data, then you could do random sampling and you could make sure that that doesn't happen. But that's one thing to bear in mind. If you ask people in exchange for something, perhaps, people are going to self-select and you might not get a representative sample, okay? There were also queries about limitations to the questionnaire. So I share an office with Jen, who did this stuff, and her constant worry about this stuff was the ambiguity of the word leftovers. So if I give you a survey and it says, how much leftovers did you have on the meal on Saturday night, you might look at that and think that I mean how much was left in the pan when you served at the meal, right? But someone else might look at that and think, how much was left on the plate? How much did you throw in the bin in terms of after you finished your meal? And of course, with the questionnaire, we've just sent it out and people have interpreted that as they will. So there could be ambiguity in terms of terminology and language. And I think the final thing to think about in terms of data sets, in terms of what we did, is time constraints. This didn't take a lot of time because we already had the data sets. We didn't have to worry about recruiting participants, getting people to fill in things, getting them back, coding. We had everything there. But obviously, because we already had it, we were restricted to what was there. If you do your own, it'll take longer, but you can do whatever you want. You can make sure that it's representative, or you can make sure that the language is less ambiguous, for example, okay? So I'm sure there's more to consider, but those are just some things that came out of our research. So, surveys. The other thing that we did was, or will do, is content analysis. So this is me, and Dan Welsh is the other member of the team who was involved with this. At this point in the project, we should have done this already. That was the original plan. As it happened, so what we're supposed to be doing is looking at grey literature on food waste, retailer websites, retailer CSR reports, or corporate social responsibility reports, and NGO communications. We were going to start with this and do things like keyword searches, different themes, and this is to do with tracing the discursive analysis of food waste. How is this changing over time? What actually happened was we used the documents to identify key stakeholders, and everyone was so keen to be involved that we started setting up the interviews very quickly. So we sort of put this on the back burner and we've finished all the interviews. So we will come back to this, but we haven't actually done a lot of it yet. I can talk in more detail about this if you want, but we don't have results at this point. What it was useful for was the basis of the interview questionnaire. So we started going through these documents very sort of briefly, but we found a lot of things that were important in terms of questions, problems about food waste, who people were engaging with, and it was helpful in terms of the interviews. So we'll come back to this. Once we'd identified the stakeholders, we went ahead and did the interviews. People were really keen, so we just started immediately. And Dan and I have also been involved with this, and David's been doing the interviews as well. So what we've done is mainly individual interviews, so generally ringing one person and going in and interviewing one person, sometimes two or three if that's what they wanted to do, but generally they've been interviews with one person. In terms of the questions that we've been asking, we've had both broad and quite specific questions. So we've asked people things like, why is food waste a problem? A really broad question, and we've had a huge variety of responses to that kind of thing. And then more specific things like, how does your organisation engage with the media over the issue of food waste? They've generally been quite open questions that we've used, but we have had some stuff like, do you think more regulation on food waste would be important? Yes or no? Of course, if that was a survey, you would get yes, no, tick. But because it's an interview, we've been able to kind of say, oh, that's interesting. Why do you think that is, or why is that important? And people have elaborated. The interview schedule has been quite structured, as in we go in with a page of questions and we go through the questions. But what we've tried to do, and what I think it's really important to try and do if you're doing interviews, is to be quite flexible with the person. So if a person has responded to the problem of food waste by talking about regulation, then we've just jumped to regulation and tried to be flexible with the questions. And I think it's one thing, I took a slide out in terms of practicalities because it was getting a bit long, but one of the things I had on my practicality slide was the importance of practicing the interview, doing a pilot study maybe, because once you've got the interview questions in your head, it's a lot easier to be flexible in terms of doing the interview. And we were very careful about tailoring the interview to the respondent that we were talking to. So we had a retailer interview schedule and a non-retailer interview schedule, and that was the sort of basic that we had. But what we often did, sometimes 10 minutes before the interview, was sit down together and come up with, imagine, so we interviewed someone from the House of Lords, and we knew that there was this huge report that was already there from the House of Lords. So we were very careful to read the report and make sure that in terms of our questions, if there was something that we were asking that was already in the report, we would say, we noticed that you've already talked about this. Can you tell us a little bit more about X? Or we saw that you received evidence from such and such a person. What was their reaction when the report came out? Or just to be clear with other people that we know what they've said, and then we're not just getting the report repeated in the interview, because then the interview becomes superfluous. So tailoring was really important. We recorded all the interviews, and we had them professionally transcribed. So I think there was one instance when the tape recorder turned itself off right in the middle of the interview, but it was just for a few seconds and it was fixed. Apart from that, we've got transcripts of absolutely everything, which has been really important for the analysis because we've gone through everything very meticulously in terms of coding and finding themes. And this has been a really iterative thing, which we're still doing. We're still busy analysing at the moment. And I can answer any questions about anything there. So we interviewed 31 companies, well, retailers, NGOs, consultants and policymakers. So this is who we've spoken to so far. We're still hoping to speak to the cooperative and someone else from DEFRA. That's what's on the itinerary to come. But that's who we've actually got in contact with. And we found everyone to be very, very keen to be involved and to talk to us. And like I say, in terms of themes, we're still at the beginning of this. We're still coming up with different themes. But one thing we found, so this is the basis of one paper, what we expected to find sociologically is a lot of emphasis on the responsibilization of the consumer. It's the consumer's fault that there's food waste. That's the general message that comes out of the literature. And what we did find actually is that there's lots of talk about the distribution of responsibility. So this is a shared thing. It's a collaborative endeavour. Everyone's responsible for food waste. And that was something very interesting that we hadn't expected. With what we called a co-production of the food waste agenda, everyone coming on board with the issue. And we found a complex network of interdependent stakeholders. So retailers talking to NGOs, talking to policymakers, talking to consultants, everyone working together on this. Obviously, that's not 100% correct across everyone, but that's one of the general themes that we found. And that's the basis of one paper that we're going to write. Oops. The other thing is to do with justice and bottom line issues. So in terms of motivations, why engage in food waste? Why care about it, especially for retailers? A lot of people talked about environmental issues, moral issues, ethics in terms of, there's people starving, it's not okay to have food waste, and these were, quite strong themes. But on the other hand, you've got people talking about saving money, the importance of branding. You go to X supermarket because they do good things on food waste. So this is something else that we're looking at, this contrast between justice and financial. So those are just, like I say, it's very early, and I can answer questions, but those are two things that we're doing at the moment. Issues to consider in terms of interviews. So what I'm quickly going to do here is tell you about my PhD research on the back of a postcard. So for my PhD, I looked at the communication of climate change in large corporations, and I interviewed so-called climate champions, so individuals who, alongside their regular job, are responsible for promoting the lights being turned off, recycling, etc. And I wanted to do something similar to what we've been doing on the food waste project. I wanted to sit down and talk to people, quite a structured interview, and thematise it the way we've done here, analysing the data. And I think in terms of the issues to consider, I've had really different experiences between the PhD and the food waste project. With the food waste project, access has actually been, I'm loath to say easy, but quite straightforward. So we had connections to WRAP, which is the World Resources Action Plan. And because we were working with them, we had them as a contact. So they put us in touch with retailers that they knew, NGOs that they knew. And then because we had those basic contacts, if you're doing interviews, if you could manage to get basic contacts, when we were cold calling people, we could ring up and say, we've already got such and such, Asda's already talking to us, Sainsbury's, don't you think you should talk to us as well? And Sainsbury's would say, oh, Asda and Tesco are on board. All right, okay, I'll come along. So that was a really useful thing to be able to sort of name drop the people you've already got in order to get more contacts. And also food waste is, but certainly was, a high profile issue. This is something that people were really keen to talk about, especially the retailers, really keen to tell us what they were doing, how they were tackling this problem. With a PhD, this was a lot more difficult. I didn't have any contacts at all, and I was just cold calling everyone and anyone. And I still managed to get a lot of champions to talk to me, but it was a really, really long process. In terms of representativeness, with the food waste project, because people were so keen, we were able to say, yeah, we've got retailers, we've got NGOs, we've got policymakers, we've got consultants, we've got a wide spread of people that we can compare. With a PhD, it was a bit of self-selection. I was talking to anyone who would talk to me. So although they were all businesses, it's not a representative sample of business. From a qualitative point of view, you might argue that that doesn't matter because it's the depth of the data that you're interested in. You're getting a rich sample, long transcripts with lots of different themes. So it doesn't really matter that it's not representative, but it's nice if it is. So in terms of access, any way that you can get in, that's going to give you a nice representative sample. That's a good way to go. In terms of breadth, what you lose with the interviews is that it's the size of the data. So we did 31 interviews with the food waste and 43 I did for the PhD, but that's not 27,000 respondents like we've got in the quantitative stuff. So it's a trade-off between the depth and the breadth. It depends on what you want to find out. And time constraints, it's always a consideration, but with the food waste, because we had the contacts in place, because we knew what we wanted to do very quickly, the process was a lot quicker to get in, get the interviews done, and now we've got a lot of time left to analyse the data. With a PhD, it took me a long time to get in and get the data sorted, the contacts sorted, and also I had to transcribe all my own transcripts, which took a really, really long time. And you'll know if you're PhD students, the budget is very small, so you do end up doing that kind of thing yourself. With the food waste, we had someone doing that, so that didn't take as much time. So again, I can answer questions, but that's basically what we did with the interviews. In terms of the ethnographic work, hang on. I'm gonna have to rely more on my notes because this is David's stuff. So this was a project that David did before the initial food waste project. He went into people's homes and what he describes as sustained and intimate contact with people. So this was an ethnographic study over 8 months, November 2009 to July 2010. And he went to 19 households from 2 ordinary streets in Manchester. Ordinary as in no particular reason for choosing them. He was just interested in why food passes into waste. Why do people waste food in households? So he wasn't looking for particular characteristics. He just wanted to see what was going on. He had 11 houses from one street and 8 from the other. And he recruited people basically by putting information leaflets through the door and then going along and knocking and saying, will you please let me come in and have a look at how much food you waste? I think he framed it as a bigger project so that people didn't feel as if they were being sort of critically looked at. And he did a number of different things. So he did repeat in-depth interviews, so I guess similar to the interviews that we're doing. But he also just went what he calls hanging out. He just went into people's houses and watched what they were doing, and interviewing and observing in situ. So while he was there, saying to people, I noticed that there's a cabbage still in the fridge that was here last time I was here. Can you tell me why that cabbage hasn't been used? And people would tell him, right? He would also go along with them to the shops. So go around. He talks about going with one woman who goes down the frozen food aisle and puts pies and chips and pizzas into the trolley, and is really embarrassed about the fact that she's got all this food that isn't like proper food, but how it's not wasted because then it goes in the freezer, okay? And he also did cupboard and fridge rummages. So basically looking through people's cupboards and seeing what's there and what they were throwing out, what they were doing with the food. I've only put a couple of things down here. I think if you're interested in this, you can't really grasp how interesting it is without reading the whole paper. These are 2 of the papers that he's written. The PowerPoint, I understand, is going to be available somewhere, so you don't need to write down references. But he gives, I've got a couple of examples here, and I wrote down what he's talked about. So in terms of feeding the family, he talks about the importance of, so one of the commonly accepted things about food waste is that people don't know what they're doing with food, right? We waste food because we don't have the knowledge to cook leftovers. And what he says is, in his experience of being in these houses, it's not about people not knowing what to do, it's about people having to deal with the sort of everyday practicalities of family. So he talks about one woman who he noticed she had spinach left over in the fridge, and he says to her, what's going to happen to the spinach? Why haven't you used it? And she says, well, if I was here by myself, I would have used it, but I've got the kids to think about. And if I make a spinach omelette, the kids aren't going to eat that. So there's no point, and it ends up going in the bin. It's a lot more nuanced than that, but that's one example. And he also talks about the fridge as a conduit for waste, and the fact that people don't like throwing out good food. So what he found was that, imagine you did an interview, and you said to someone, I don't know, how many peppers do you throw out a week? And the person might say, oh, 3 peppers. Then you would say, well, why did they get thrown out? Oh, well, we didn't use them for this reason or that reason. But what he found, because he was in the house, he got to see the process through which the pepper got used or not got used. He got to see what was actually happening. So the pepper was there, it was used for half a meal. Half of the pepper went to the fridge because it was still good, they didn't want to get rid of it. They left it in the fridge for it to decompose, and then they put it in the bin because then it was okay to throw it out. So he talks about the fridge being this sort of conduit to keep good food until it goes bad, and then it can go in the bin. And those are just, like I say, out of context. It's difficult to explain it. But if you have a look at the papers, they're really interesting ethnographic studies, and they give you a good insight into the kinds of things that an ethnography can do. Okay. And then just thinking through some of the things that you might consider in terms of an ethnography. In terms of depth, I think this is the biggest advantage to an ethnography. I've never done one personally, but I'm always fascinated to read about them. People sort of, going in and looking in depth at people's lives, at what they're actually doing. And like I say, you're getting that really nuanced, not just asking people what's happening, not just getting them to tick boxes, but actually seeing the processes through which things are happening. Access, I think, is even harder than an interview situation. 19 houses is pretty impressive, considering you wanted to go in and look through people's cupboards. He's obviously, a pretty persuasive guy. People did talk to him, but I think access is a really difficult thing, getting people on board. In terms of representativeness, he does note that the streets weren't too bad. There was a spread of sort of income, composition of house, type of job, level of education, but that's not what he was really going for. It was the depth that he wanted, it was the richness of the data. And it's not really the kind of thing that you can draw big generalizations from. But because of the depth of the data, you can still say something really interesting, even if it's not representative. And something David doesn't talk about particularly, but something I always wonder about with ethnography, is this idea of affecting participants. So it seems to me, reading the papers, that people were quite honest about what they were doing with food waste. It doesn't seem like they were changing what they were doing because he was there, but I think that's always the big danger with ethnography, that you're not getting a true reflection of what's actually going on because you are there, okay? So again, there's just some things that you might think about if you were going to do that kind of study. So I've talked way too long, and that's the 4 things that we've covered, the 4 different methods. And I'm happy to answer any questions or anything in terms of the methods or the general project or anything.
With regards to the interview,
Yep.
how the analysis of the interviews, how do you codify them? You said that then after the analysis, how's the process of you analyzing the interview?
Yeah, well, with the so with this one, I'm not sure we really had a system. With the PhD, I did discourse analysis. I don't know if anyone's... So a discourse is like a way of looking at the world. And what I was interested in with the PhD was the different ways that people were talking about climate change. So I already had 8 discourses, 8 different ways of thinking about the world set out. And when I did the analysis, I was looking for particular components of each discourse. In terms of the food waste stuff, we've generally just gone through, and in terms of the themes that had already come out of the grey literature, the things that we thought were interesting, we've just sort of picked out, and we haven't really, there hasn't been a systematic, it's been a very meticulous process in terms of reading everything very carefully, but we haven't done anything systematic in terms of looking for particular things. It's been quite data-led, I guess. We've read the transcript, come up with something interesting, and started making notes, gone on the next transcript, come up with something interesting. It's very iterative, because if you get a transcript 6 and there's something really interesting, you go back to transcript 1 and see if there was, but yeah, we haven't been, at this point, we haven't been very systematic. I think once we had an idea for the 2 papers, then we've been very systematic going back and looking for particular things. But in the first instance, it was just a case of reading them, listening to them, and trying to see what came out. Yeah?
How much information would you provide about the research goal in the beginning towards your interviewees? How did you had some findings how this would bias the answers? And I mean, on the one side, you would like to provide a trustful environment, but on the other side, also not to spoil answers and to guide them towards certain directions.
Yeah, in the, I guess with the food waste one, we had they were sent a 2-page summary of the project, which informed them in the first instance that we get funding from Tesco, because as you can imagine, because we're talking to retailers, people are sometimes a bit dubious about the fact that Tesco provides some of our funding. It's got nothing to do with Tesco, what we do with the research. Tesco don't influence what we do, but obviously that's an acceptable concern for other retailers to have. So they were given information about that. You know, Tesco isn't involved in any way. But yeah, they were just given a 2-page summary saying, you know, we're interested in how the problems come about, what people are doing to try and deal with it, how it's being constructed. And they were given like a frequently asked questions sheet. So things like, how will my information be used? Is this anonymous? You know, can I specify that some things can't be repeated? And they were just, it was quite an open process. There's no sort of, I don't think there's anything we've done which people wouldn't have been happy with anyway. But yeah, we give them information in the first instance. Does that answer your question? Yeah?
It's more of a plea to the other people in this room. If something goes wrong, fess up. I was interviewed by someone not to do with this project, and I agreed to be interviewed on the basis that she would send me a transcript within a month. And then a month came and went, and then I wrote to her, and she waffled, and I wrote back, and she waffled some more, and eventually I went to her supervisor, and it turned out that her voice recorder hadn't worked.
Right.
And that's fine, accidents happen, but she knew straight away that her voice recorder hadn't worked, and she could have emailed me and said, really sorry, but instead she had hoped that I would just forget or be waffled off. And it was really, really depressing, and it made me not do more interviews for a long time, which probably didn't hurt any other researchers. But as ethically, if something screws up, admit it straight away.
Yeah, I mean, we, like I said, we recorded everything, and everyone that we spoke to was offered the opportunity to have a look at the transcript. They were told, or they have been told, that obviously we have to get it back from the transcriber in the first instance. And David's been through and sort of tidied up the ums and the ahs and the, so they don't have them back yet, but people will get the transcripts back to, just to make sure that they're happy with what's been said. I did a blog post not long after we did the interviews, so we'd only done sort of a couple of interviews, and I emailed the person who I'd quoted to say, you said this in the interview, do you mind, if I use it in a blog post? And he came back and said, I didn't say that in the interview. And I was like, well, you did say that in the interview, but if you'd rather I didn't quote you on it, and he said, well, you can say the first bit, but I'm not really that comfortable with the second bit, and that's fine. I mean, that's the reason we asked. But yeah, I mean, we will send them back and check that people are okay. But everything is anonymous, so it's not as it shouldn't be problematic as such. Anything else? Anything that would help with your own research in terms of the stuff that you're doing? No? That's fine. So I think it's the end of the day. Is everything finished now? Yes? Okay, then I haven't been here all day, but I hope it's been helpful, whatever it is that you've been to, and I hope this has been helpful. And I'm just at the SCI, so if you did come up with something that you'd be interested in hearing more about, or you had questions about anything, feel free to drop me an email. I'm always looking for an excuse to do an email instead of doing real work. Okay, you can go, you're fine.